Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Kate Mosse, and I've been delighted to be doing many of these pre-performance talks. By my reckoning, this is the 8th pre-performance talk, and I think the 25th of the talks that are going on to support the amazing productions in the 3 wonderful spaces that we have here. Tonight, it is my very particular honour to introduce Jonathan Church. He's here, of course, tonight to talk about directing Brecht and the Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. But of course, it's a great pleasure, as you all know, because Jonathan is the artistic director of Chichester Festival Theatre. And of course, he will say he has an enormous team of people, but we all know that the way that these things get transferred is always from the artistic person leading it. So to be here in the 50th year, to interview the man who has played this enormous part about bringing our wonderful theatre back to where it should be is a particular pleasure. So Jonathan has also got a bit of a sore throat. So
yes, too many notes to the actors.
Too many notes to the poor actors. One of the things when we were doing the CFT 50th anniversary book, there's a lovely little story from Sam Mendes about how when he first arrived in Chichester and he went across the car park and he saw all the things that were being on and he thought, I'm not going to be the right man for Chichester. He said, because all I'd done at Cambridge was all the B's, most important amongst them, Brecht. So he didn't think that Brecht was a Chichester playwright. Why did you choose Brecht? Do you disagree with him?
There hasn't been a huge history of Brecht here. It's a bit like Tennessee Williams. They're sort of 2 playwrights that you imagine, given the nature of the spaces and the epic scale of particularly the festival theatre, you'd have thought that we would have seen One Dame or Others, Mother Courage, or a Galileo, but they haven't. And I think, not surprisingly, Brecht is considered by audiences to be difficult. And I suppose when I arrived here, I wanted to find a way to bring Brecht here. And this isn't the first attempt. Funnily enough, I commissioned a version of Mother Courage because I couldn't think of a better stage to do Mother Courage on than the Festival Theatre. You know, I'd just seen a production that had failed to make the cut a kind of living, breathing part of the show. So I commissioned an adaptation by David Edgar, only to find that the National Theatre had programmed it, so no self-respecting actress was going to tackle it just as the National Theatre were doing it. So this came about really in conversation with Henry Goodman, because a bit like Hamlet, Arturo Ui is a play that you can't contemplate without knowing who's going to play Hitler or Ui. And so it was very much a desire to introduce Brecht to one of these spaces, and Ui was the one that came along because of Henry that felt like the right fit.
And of course, it's you made reference then to the sort of sense of Brecht being seen as difficult, but it's really that sort of sense of epic theatre and the combination of an epic stage, but also this very highly stylized and allegorical writing. Do you think people are just not so attracted by subtext and subtext and subtext, or is it just?
I don't know. I think there's a very for anybody who's studied drama or often English, Brecht is linked with the idea of alienation, and which does sound like the opposite thing that an audience might want.
Festival.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, hey, alienation.
It's not an easy thing. I mean, it's very hard talking about Brecht. I mean, I think what's fascinating is the 2 Brecht plays I've worked on are Galileo and this one, and for all that's talked about, Brecht's techniques and what he wants to do to an audience, actually, as a writer, he's a very sophisticated storyteller, and Arturo Ui is, in a sense, his attempt at writing a Shakespearean play. There are hundreds of references to Shakespeare plays, particularly Richard III. It's written predominantly in verse, and it's structured very like a Shakespeare play. So although there are things that are different, no other playwright would tackle some of the ideas in the same way. That's not true for most of it. And I saw, and I think there are productions of Brecht's plays that focus on those elements. And I saw a production of Arturo Ui recently while I was doing my research. And all I can say is that the scene changes and the first 5 minutes of each scene were brilliant. They were so stylized and heightened. I just sat there going, wow, this is gobsmacking, this is astonishing, this has got something to tell me about how to do Brecht. But then 10 minutes into a 12-minute scene, and he does write big, long, chunky dialogue scenes, anything that's to do with style disappears, and all you're left with is character, story, plot. And if you haven't honoured those in the way you would with a great Shakespeare play or any other playwright, it hits the ground. So I suppose both times I've approached Brecht's plays, in a way I've approached them in completely the opposite way to how you might expect, which is about how do you make the story work for an audience as if it weren't a Brecht play, which is a dreadful, probably a dreadful admission about my own lack of understanding about what Brecht would have wanted. But I also think Brecht would have celebrated what these spaces, these thrust spaces, do in terms of a relationship with an audience. I was terribly surprised. Henry and I went off to the Berliner Ensemble to see a 1980s production of Uwe that's still in the repertoire. And I couldn't believe it. The Berliner Ensemble is in a beautiful, gilded proscenium. Everything politically I might have imagined about how Brecht might have presented his plays. The theatre that contained those plays was in the absolute opposite. It would be like doing it...
Did it feel claustrophobic as opposed to expansive?
No. The one thing that did feel fascinating was its depth. It was as if you'd taken the Haymarket Theatre in London and doubled its depth. Oh. And they'd rather cleverly stripped back the floor. Either it was a very clever set or it really was the floor of the theatre where you could see the revolver that was used for Mother Courage. And that floor, funnily enough, it slightly inspired this, had the patina of what felt like 70 years of actors and Mother Courage's cart, gouging lines into it. So it felt as old as the Berliner Ensemble. Now, whether that was a brilliant scenic design or whether they'd stripped it back to the floor, that was the only thing that kind of gave me a feel. But I do think the very relationship with the audience that this theatre and the Festival Theatre has makes you look at the ideas and changes the relationship with the audience. There's a few public scenes in Arturo Ui where you'll see hung above you a little, not our normal house lights, but lights that mirror the lights that are on stage. We had what we thought was a Brechtian idea. Whenever you were in a public scene, we'd switch those on and make you light up and become part of the action. In actual fact, once we looked at it, it seemed a slightly silly device because in most of those scenes anyway, the actors can see the audience and that connection is there without being quite as literal as switching a light bulb on over your head. We do still use it for one final scene just to slightly emphasise the scale of the crowd.
And particularly with this play, the fact that you actually put actors up into the audience is wonderful because that sense of the collusion, how easy it is, when a good man just turns away. How many of you have seen it so far in the audience? And the rest of you, I imagine, already have your tickets? Good, excellent. The thing that obviously people know about the play, I suppose, before they go and see it is that although it's set... it's Chicago mobster gangland, 30s. It's actually a quite clear parable almost about the rise of Hitler. And each of the characters, from Uwe himself as Hitler, are Goebbels, from all of those sorts of people. And most of the scenes in the play, if not all of them, are specific references. It's not just implied, is it? So that Cicero, the town that they try to take over, is the Anschluss in Austria. So with those sorts of things, it's all in there, and you have that as a director. Do you then have to try and pedal it down so it doesn't... People who don't know as much, it was written in 1941, people knew what Brecht was writing about then.
There's a very big decision with this play, which we made when he wrote it, or actually shortly after he wrote it. he added a series of what he called legends. And I mean, anybody who's seen Brecht plays, he loved projecting titles, ideas, so that you made the audience think about what they were watching. He wrote a series of legends that literally described the parallel of the scenes. And so would give you the historical context of what was going on in Hitler's life and in Germany at that point. The same happens in a lot of his plays, although actually not as bluntly.
No, it's really explicit.
Yes, it just says this happened in this year. And you've got a very big choice about whether you choose to project them or not. Now, the version that we've used, and there were hundreds of versions to choose from of Uwe, it's been one of the most translated of his plays. We used the very first one that was done in Britain, which was by a guy called George de Bory, which was done for the very famous Leonard Rossiter version, directed by Michael Blakemore. They'd decided in that version not to use those legends, and I think the version we chose decided not to use them, and I think we felt that if somebody knew their history, then those parallels might well be obvious. If they didn't know the history, if you were playing to a 15-year-old schoolchild who came in, some of the literal historical references, if you didn't know them, would be meaningless. And so I felt it might be overcomplicating or perhaps alienating the audience in the wrong way. I mean, for ages while we were planning it, I think there's a little bit of brickwork up there that we kept going, well, if we decide to put them in, we could always project it up there. But we never quite got as far as trying it, because I suppose that I wanted to make the power of the storytelling strong enough that it didn't matter. I mean, this is just me, and Brecht might hate this, but explaining something to an audience that they really don't need to know, or in some way patronising them, or making them feel stupid because they don't need a reference, they don't understand
Funny
the
enough,
reference.
I think also you lose the opportunity of something better, which is, when I saw it, in the interval, people were enjoying being able to say, was that speech from Julius Caesar? Or was that supposed to be... So actually, it's a nicer way of saying, letting the audience feel clever, actually.
Well, I think, yes, I think...
If you, there you are.
We do list them, we do put them in the programme for those who want to know what Brecht said, but that was our approach. And again, it might, whether Brecht would have approved, I don't know. I mean, the other thing that's been extraordinary about this process is most of Brecht's plays he worked on in performance. So he helped shape the decisions that were made around the first productions. Brecht never saw this play performed in his lifetime.
So it's like an uncut version, really.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to describe to somebody what it's like. It's like a first quarto of a Shakespeare before he's seen it on stage. And so any decisions that are made are the translator making those decisions, and then you as a director and you as a company, making another set of decisions. But Brecht is less apparent. I mean, even the fact that he wrote the legend slightly later.
Yes. But he didn't intend it even to be performed in Germany particularly, did he? He was writing it for American.
Yeah, I think he imagined that it would be performed in America first. Although it was performed I think it was performed in Germany first, ironically, but after his death.
I mean, the thing that I felt seeing it, I have to say, many of you in the audience have been to a lot of these, so you know that I don't always say this, not just because the director's here, but it is for me so far the piece that I've enjoyed the most about this season, and it's already been an incredible season. And what it was that the second it started with that prologue, and of course the prologue, everybody telling you who you're going to meet and what they're doing, it felt almost like Keystone Cops, incredible music, it was so dynamic, it sort of hit the floor running. And it felt, sitting in the audience, that everybody just went, oh, I see. You knew that you were in for an extraordinary performance. And you have got a staggering cast, not just only Henry Goodman, who is exceptional, I think, but you have Joe McGann, you have the wonderful Keith Baxter, the wonderful Michael Feast. I mean, everybody actually in there. And did you deliberately do that? Because it is so around Uwe that I can imagine you could small cast round that central role.
Well, it wasn't that deliberate, except in terms of wanting to make the story work. I felt finding the best actors to possibly deliver that. I mean, Roma, who Mickey Feast plays, is a huge part just in physical line terms. And when we're first introduced to Uwe, he's slightly inactive. And so the early scenes with the gangsters are driven by him. So for me, it was about, in storytelling, who can we best get to drive those scenes. And similarly with the wonderful older actors, both the actor teaching Uwe how to walk, sit and stand with lovely Keith Baxter
is just.
I mean, it's a brilliant scene, but to not, to have an actor who brings something of an older style of acting into this, quite modern play. We just worked very hard to cast it as well as possible, and actually the luxury of both doing it here in Chichester, with actually most of the actors you talk about. We've worked with before, so we've got a relationship with them. I think the other thing is a lot of actors were excited about the opportunity of working on this play with Henry. So we were able to attract a kind of brilliantly
because his horrible word this, but his journey from being a feeble, slightly, there's something quite repulsive about him. You wouldn't want to touch his hand, would you, at the beginning? Then to the final scene, which I will not spoil for those of you who haven't seen it, when, I mean, that... It's all right, he doesn't strip off, yes, yeah, but I mean,
that
you
can
will
be interpreted in many ways.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, that really takes some doing. But all the way through, there is this awful undercurrent of fear and the turning point, but it's also very funny, and you feel complicit by laughing all the time. That
is where Brecht is really clever in that, the message of the play, and there is an epilogue that again tells the audience what the message of the play is, as there is a prologue, and it does challenge the audience to look at their role in what happens to their community, their country as citizens. The fact that he allows you to be seduced by this man. It's like a lot of kind of, it's a brilliant thing in drama, isn't it? It's very like Richard III, that you want to see that particular kind of theatrical villain succeeding and winning and playing games with people. We relish it. What Brecht takes a step further is he then pulls you out from it and goes, hang on a minute, you might have enjoyed and thought this delicious, but there's a real message here and you should be very scared. Yes. And there's a line in that epilogue about horror in the heart of farce. And the whole process that we've been through, and Henry's always been passionate about this, is that to make the play work, it has to be both funny and frightening. And without that that kind of contrast between the two opposite ends of the string, the play doesn't really work.
And one of the obviously incredibly important that you've mentioned that many of the actors either know each other or know these stages. I saw some of the younger ones had all been in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern last year. So that, of course, helps, I imagine, with the ensemble. But it seemed to me also that not only the extraordinary set, but the wonderful design and the music as well. There seemed to be a real coherence about everybody trying to create something really very special.
Well actually, one always tries to create a company that works hard and supports each other and explores a play. I suppose that what's brilliant about a play that has such an important message and is so big is that I think everybody signs up to do the play because they believe in that message, yes, or want to look at it. So the way that they worked on this text, and also we made quite a few trims along the way to try and shape it. And,
did you talk a lot about Brechtian theory? I mean, how analytical was it in the rehearsal room?
No, because...
I don't know why you're all laughing. It's a legitimate...
No, I remember once having to... when I was struggling young director, I had to go in and teach the difference between Brecht and Stanislavski to GCSE drama students. I struggled. And so, no, we didn't talk a lot about that. I mean, our main focus was always on sort of story and meaning and how it all connected, and to a certain amount style. But no, we didn't talk a lot about Brecht. That's partly that I didn't have a theory of how to, what I've read an awful lot of what Brecht's written over the years, and I've always slightly struggled in terms of how you put that into action. And so the closest I can describe the way we've worked on it is to approach it like a Shakespeare play. And in the same way, you're looking at character and story and meaning and links and the language.
So you're not actually deadening the storytelling by theory?
No, we're trying to find... And also the language, because it's written in verse, the language, you talk about that prologue, the great thing that prologue does is also gives you 5 minutes where you tune in.
Yeah, you put out your stall very clearly, don't you?
This is going to be a play about this, we're going to speak in verse, it's going to be hard work, but it might be fun, and off we go.
Because it's very interesting, because it doesn't feel like hard work at all. I mean, it really, it didn't to me. But I also like that old-fashioned prologue approach, actually, that you go, okay, that's him, that's her, that's, so you know who you're, expecting, I suppose.
No, I think it's really helpful. And again, I mean, I remember first of all when we looked at it, you wonder nowadays if you have somebody who apparently narrates, you expect them to appear all the way through the play and keep you informed, which is the way a lot of novel adaptations have worked. Of course, Shakespeare doesn't do that. He'll often have a prologue and then an epilogue that are, so it's a Shakespearean device taken to a sort of different extreme in both cases.
So now, you've talked obviously that there are challenges. Nobody goes into doing a Brecht anywhere, never mind, without the challenges. You also seem very joyful about it and what's been created. What has surprised you about the production and the way it's worked? Is it the play you thought you would be directing when the lights go down on, when it opens tomorrow night? Is that what you had always imagined it would look like? It's always
different. Actually, it was what Simon Higlett and I, Simon who designed it, we've worked together on a lot of shows. It was the single hardest show for us to design.
Because?
Because it has 17 different scenes, and in some ways, like a Shakespeare, it feels like it demands a certain amount of stuff with some of those scenes, but it also seems to beg for an overriding idea. And so we did, yes, we very much struggled with how to deliver it, which I think is linked to not quite having a completely clear picture of what the finished article was going to be. And I think it's nothing like I imagined it would be, but what it does do is capture a lot of the ideas that we thought we might. So when we started talking about the music, for instance, we knew we were starting in 30s in that kind of speakeasy gangster world, and Buddy, can you spare a dime? We knew that musically there was a journey that went probably from there to Wagner. And so quite how that's played out within the piece. When we started casting it, we thought all the music might be recorded, and then at some point we thought, what if more of the music is live? And so we've ended up with an extraordinary group of actors who can also play instruments, and so that's become part of it in a way that I never expected.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful part of it, I thought, the live band on stage.
Well, again, it's part of the seduction, I think. You're led into a world that you're kind of comfortable with.
It's cabaret in a way, isn't it? And you think, oh, this is going to be fine, and then it's really not fine. I don't know if anybody knew that about the Second World War and Hitler, but it doesn't end well. No.
I think the thing that was hardest to predict, and we've still, there are still many ways of looking at it, was in terms of how far we take this parallel with Hitler. I mean, there are various choices. And I feel we've made a set of choices that are linked to us as a company, our production, and to Henry, because you could choose to make the parallel with Hitler completely non-visual. You could, and actually I think the first production in Germany, I think was Brecht's son-in-law who played Hitler, Eckhard Schall. I have a memory of reading a review that said he had a ginger wig.
Yes.
I
think it might have been a bit
but
close
it
to
went
the-
very close. So you could approach it without any visual reference to Hitler. We've chosen, I think, partly because we stripped away the legends and the information, that actually the strong story that will be recognisable to every man, woman, and child in the audience will be that man who we've all seen so many thousand images of. So we've probably taken a more literal line on representing him than some productions might. And choices about whether you see armbands or Nazi images or swastikas. You could do a really successful production that did none of that, and that you just kept it completely rooted in that Chicago world, and the parallel would be there. Brecht doesn't suggest that it's ever made literal, but we've decided to take that a little further, and I enjoy, the sort of electric shocks of some of the things that we do. I won't give away the one that makes me laugh most, but there's a couple of decisions where you do get a sort of direct, electric shock where the parallel is made so literal that you can't help but recognise it, think about it, and a bit of me goes in a different way. Brecht might be proud of those moments.
Yes.
In terms of reminding the audience of the connection.
Because there is an element of, that's why I use Keystone Cops, is that it's the frantic speed of it and the music and that it is a bit bish bash bosh. And that seemed to me very, very seductive, because you do just join in and have fun, and then you think, oh.
Well, one of the things, again, it was very interesting that when we were looking at the piece, Brecht was in America, and there were films that he must have seen. I mean, the one we've got, funnily enough, it's there. The one that we know he saw and that we all watched was the original Scarface. And what's fascinating about it is because the film companies knew that they were tackling a serious issue, a bit like Brecht. If you go and get the video of Scarface, the first minute is a public health warning, basically going, this film depicts something that is the scourge of our cities and you must stamp it out. But, it's the health warning that, smoking one of that, before you light the cigarette, it's going to kill you. And it's fascinatingly Brechtian. And these were film companies. It also happens on, there's a Jimmy Cagney film, and I can't remember what it's called, of similar era. But those films also play this.
Chaplin film, The Great Dictator.
And The Great Dictator. They all, play on the audience's delight of this dark underworld.
When I was listening to the actors, I couldn't decide whether their accents were moving from, absolutely Chicago, plums in the mouth type thing, to something more sinister. I just couldn't quite tell how the voices, or whether they were all, because his voice changes so much, and it reflects back to the rest of the cast.
Yeah, I think that's probably what's going. Yes, we, in a sense, we encourage the rest of the cast not to change. Henry, we've very deliberately plotted an attempt, because he goes for elocution lessons in the middle of the play. We've plotted an attempt to show his social climbing, and I think some of the characters you're introduced to later in the play, as he's moving, as he's about to go and take over Cicero, Austria, you meet people who are from a higher social level. So there is a sense of progression within the play.
When you were just mentioning now about the clear and explicit parallels, and you chose to interpret it absolutely, does that sort of allegorical style of, many writers, but Brecht obviously, mean that you are less free to bring in modern echoes or interpretations, that sort of way of referencing out even further? You
could easily make all sorts of there is a production, I suppose, that looks at that jumping to a different dictator. It's very interesting that there's that film out called The Dictator at the moment, which I deliberately haven't gone to see, but it's the same premise, isn't it? It's the great dictator. You take a different. Yes, it's very tempting to make those parallels literal. And Henry and I talked quite a bit about this while we were planning, and we decided how many layers can you add? And we decided that this was specifically about Hitler, and the epilogue talks about watch out, what's happening. We may have got rid of him, but that doesn't mean that somebody else isn't going to be there. And we made it was one of our sort of rules that while there might be echoes, those echoes were there to be sniffed out, not illustrated. And I'm very pleased we made that
Yes, it
that
would
decision.
just be too complicated apart from anything
Yeah,
else.
I mean, there's a wonderful, there's a little moment where Mickey Feast's character talks about Uwe being hung up by his feet, which is a sort of Mussolini image. And so the echo's there, but I think if you'd gone any further to try and illustrate it, you'd have been in trouble.
With you were telling me beforehand, the word of mouth on this show is incredible. The bookings are very, very good anyway. Do you think that is because there was a focus on European theatre with your predecessors who actually introduced, whether it was Nathan the Wise or Master and Margarita, or that sort of European sensibility into the audience? Or do you think it's just the right time for Uwe?
No, I think it's several things. I think the all of you form part of it. There's a marvellous audience who I think come to the Minerva for new experiences, for challenging experiences. As much as we've got the all singing, all dancing musical over the road, which is a delight, there are those people who want something different, and I think that there's a sense of people seeking that out. And Uwe isn't a play you get to see every day, and so for the theatre connoisseur, it's a great thing to have an opportunity to see. I think yes, Ruth, Martin, and Stephen did introduce. Well, there's always been a strong European strand of work here. I think they focused a lot of people's minds on it. I also think there's Henry, not just for our audience, who they've seen him do, Prime Minister here, but given the other classical work he's done, I think I always think the juxtaposition between a leading actor in a company and the piece is really important. And I think Henry and this play, with the marvellous parts he's played, make a complete and logical connection. And I think that's partly why people have decided to come, I hope.
Yes, the sort of before this one, the famous Brecht here, of course, was Caucasian Chalk Circle with Topol, and that's the only thing people talk about when they're talking about that production. Is that same sense of the giant at the heart of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, are we going to be seeing more Brecht?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'd love to think that we will at some point do Mother Courage if we get that. I remember seeing in Nottingham, we'll have Miriam Carlin, who, if you remember, was a kind of little sparrow of a woman. Hadn't she done the rag trade or whatever? Yeah. And I remember her hauling a cart for 3 hours around the Nottingham Playhouse stage and just being blown away by it. I'd love to see that happen. I've got a great fondness for Galileo as a play,
which you've directed before.
Which I've directed before in a new version by David Edgar. I think it's the least Brechtian of all his plays. The storytelling and that great thing of that very simple dilemma of a man going, the world's like this and the heavens are like this, and it's sort of the earth's flat. No, it's not. Argument. The person who says it's round, we're always going to champion, aren't we? And there's something extraordinary about the sort of personal debate and the real life character there that would be great to do. So yeah, I hope. But it's all about. Funnily enough, given Brecht worked with an ensemble, his plays often demand astonishing leading roles to carry them. So I suspect it will be down to whether we manage to successfully get the right actors to come.
Before I throw it open for if there are any questions, because I know you have got quite a lot of pressure on this week with this opening tomorrow and then Heartbreak House and rather a lot of other things happening. Just though the season as a whole, directing a play in this enormous and important season, is that just you letting yourself have a bit of a treat?
Bit of fun.
Because you're programming such a large amount of work, you and Alan together and your associate and supporters, but
is it
it time off?
No, it's the opposite, strangely, partly because you would have thought it is on one level, because when you go into rehearsal, you lock yourself up in a dark room with 16 actors and stage management team, and for 8 hours a day, 5-6 days a week for 5, 6, 7 weeks. That's a very special thing, because I only really allow myself to do it once a year, because in terms of supporting the other directors in a festival, it's very hard if you're locked in a rehearsal room to do that. I mean, it's been hard enough to see. I've managed to catch runs and previews of Heartbreak House, but I've not managed to see Blue Remembered Hills yet, for instance. It's a very difficult thing. I always feel, because I only allow myself to do it once a year, it's a bit like running a marathon when you haven't trained for it. But when I used to direct 3 or 4 times a year, it was exactly that. Yeah. But there's something about going, and it's probably like you, the actually making yourself sit down and write, the discipline of that. If you don't do it for 10 months of the year and suddenly you make yourself do it, it's a bit of a shock to the system. I always feel like I've got bad flu for the first 2 weeks of rehearsals, because my body just and brain doesn't. I've been a butterfly for the other 10 months of the year, and suddenly I've got to focus. So it's not. But what I do love about it is that particularly with so much going on, I always have my best ideas about other programming or casting or by being in a rehearsal room, because you're so focused on this space or the connections that we're talking about plays all the time. We're talking about Julius Caesar. We're talking about all that Brecht's written, all that Shakespeare's written. Actors are talking about other plays they've been in. Your brain sort of goes into a completely different area, and so it's a delight, but a slightly painful one.
Painful delight. That's why your voice is going. Yeah. Right. Are there any questions for Jonathan? Oh, there we are.
This is my. Have you chosen a particular translation?
We did. This translation was by George Tabori, who and we've, because that was written in the early 60s. We also brought there's a writer called Alistair Beaton, who Henry and I both worked with on a marvellous play called Feel Good, that Henry was in, about the Labour Party and Tony Blair at Hampstead years ago. Alistair has been a sort of script advisor on it, making some of the dramaturgical choices, because as we said, it was sort of uncut. So he helped us make the decisions about what to cut, and a few subtle tweaks in the writing to perhaps iron out a couple of words that 40, 50 years after it was written, in translation sound a bit dated, or that don't make the verse sound as good, or maybe to get a better laugh, but I wouldn't admit to that. So we had a lot of help, but we went back to that translation.
It's very interesting with translations, and I mean, even Chekhov is still being retranslated.
Yeah. And we just went back. I mean, it's a bit like the Michael Frayn. We just went back to the one we thought was simply the best. There have been lots of people who've tried, but for me, nobody did the combination of the verse, the mock Shakespeare play, and the gangster film world, as well as George Tabori. I mean, he was a Polish American screenwriter. His family were Jewish. He was Jewish, so there's all of that. His political belief in the play, combined with his great, skill as an American screenwriter, combined with, clearly a great love of Shakespeare. The combination of him and Brecht, I think, was quite electric.
Thank you. Gentleman back there.
The play's called The Resistible Rise of Arturo Rui. In what way did that adjective resistible influence the way you directed?
Well, we did, funnily enough, we talked about the idea of the word resistible. Whenever we do a scene, we'd go, where's the attempt to resist? Does somebody succeed? Do they fail? And actually, most of the time, the people don't resist, and that's the point. I mean, occasionally people do, and they get shot. they get bullied, they get beaten up, or something else occurs that means their resistance is futile. Yeah, the word was always there in our minds when we approached each scene.
Gentleman there.
Do you think the play is exclusively referring to Hitler, or do you think it's about resistance to fascism in general? In particular, I'm thinking of whether there are parallels with Mussolini as well.
I think it's both so specifically about Hitler. I mean, like most things, it tries to do both, but it does the both so well because it's so specific about Hitler. I think, the lessons that one learns about how any dictator rises to power are, of course, much bigger than just Hitler. But the detail with which Brecht has gone into Hitler and his surrounding generals is why you make the big argument so clearly. I think if he'd been more general, you'd probably have felt less focused, and it would have done it less successfully. So I think he clearly targets both, but does it with immense research and precision about Hitler.
And all the people around him are clearly,
Yeah.
this is Goebbels, this is Goering, you know who they're supposed to be, and there's play on words in the German names.
There are. I mean, there's a wonderful thing that gave me hope from the original German production. There was a translation of the director talking about the first few days when they went into rehearsal, and they tried for all the actors to mimic Goering, Goebbels, Röhm's mannerisms and to try and be them within the characters. And the director said after 3 days of doing this, we tied ourselves in knots. It was hopeless because actually having set up a gangster world, what we had to do was find out how these gangsters operated.
The reason I asked the question in particular was that, of course, although there probably were big-time gangsters in Germany, the big-time gangsters were in Italy, and Mussolini's chief claim to fame was actually removing mafia influence from the Italian state in the 20s and 30s.
Yes, I've never seen, there's nothing I've never seen a direct reference to Mussolini. I mean, as I say, there was this idea of big, but when did Mussolini die?
45.
Yes,
He was executed by Alexander, 45.
Well, I think what Mussolini will obviously have been in his brain, when he wrote the play, and he wrote it in, was it 3 weeks? 3 weeks. Mussolini was still in power, so that must have been in his brain. But I've not seen direct, and I can only think of the one direct reference in his text. But whether that was Brecht or whether that was George Tabori, you're never quite sure.
Gentleman behind.
Yeah, Kate said the best production, initially for me, the best production I've ever seen in
Bless you, well, there you go. That's a good moment. Thank you and good night.
No. Well, actually, that is perfect timing.
Thank you. I can't believe I hadn't discovered Brecht. I feel in love with him now. But carrying on with this Mussolini question, it's difficult to believe he was pressing enough to refer early on to saying that opposed can be hung by their toes, which is just what happened to Mussolini, not by their feet, by their toes. I wonder if that's been added, and I wonder if Henry Goodman's wonderful summary at the end, in the law voice, that must have been added, mustn't it? Was that the Brecht original?
I think the epilogue, and Tom, my assistant, is around, may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the epilogue was in the original. It's been the famous line, "The bitch that bore him is in heat again," is not quite a literal translation. That is George Tabori. The line that is sort of quoted and misquoted is as much Tabori as it is Brecht, or the ideas Brecht. He did after the war make some changes, and I can't remember exactly what those changes were. Brecht made some changes, most of which aren't contained in this version from my memory of my research.
I think you might do publishing a lot of good here, because we're all going to rush out
Yeah,
and buy
yeah,
different
there's a whole-
translations now. Well, I mean, that was a lovely question to finish on. I'm sorry that I'm going to have to bring it to a close, but we must release Jonathan Church, the director, back to his cast, and also Jonathan Church, the artistic director, back to the rest of the theatre. But just to remind you that we have lots on this week. So on Thursday at 5 o'clock in Theatre on the Fly, we are doing the critics panel. I'm interviewing a range of critics, including Michael Billington and Libby Purvis, and you can come either to cheer, throw garlands or eggs, whatever you feel about them. And then on Friday night in the Festival Theatre at 5:45 will be David Hare talking about Heartbreak House, and I'll just be introducing him then. And then we have the post-production talk for Arturo Ui the following Tuesday, if you still have the stamina for this. And even if you haven't come to the performance that night, you can just come into the auditorium afterwards if there's space and join in and listen to that. And that will be members of the cast as well. So that is an enormous amount going on. I'm sure you've already seen things in the wonderful Theatre on the Fly. Heartbreak House opens on Thursday night. Arturo Ui opens tomorrow night. But for now, could you just all thank Jonathan Church with a huge thank you.